Hello listeners, we are your co-hosts Jeanine Bailey and Marie Quigley for the Empower World Coaching and Leadership Podcast. Empower World brings guests who are making a difference to the world to inspire coaches and leaders who lead with mind, heart and soul. Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Empower World Coaching and Leadership Podcast. And today I'm here with the wonderful Marie Quigley. Welcome, Marie. I'm in sunny downtown Point Lonsdale, which is an hour and a half south of Melbourne. It's a beautiful, beautiful morning, and I've just come back from a swim. So if you're watching this video, you can see my hair is still slightly wet. So I've got the summer vibe happening today. And Marie, what's it like over there where you are back in the UK?
It's 9 p.m. and I did have a walk earlier this evening and it was -3, so it was pretty chilly. My hair was probably wet when I got back as well, but not from swimming. But yeah, so it's dark. I'm cozy in my house and looking forward to having a conversation with you because it's been a while since we've been together on the podcast.
It has been. So I'm so delighted that we are back together again to discuss what promises to be a very interesting topic based on what one of the coaches have shared with you as a topic. So over to you, Marie, to introduce.
Yeah, well, big shout out to Emma, Coach Emma, who wrote in and said, can you talk about colluding in coaching and what it means when we are colluding with a client instead of being empathetic or maybe acknowledging or championing them? What are the signs? What are the things that we need to pay attention to as coaches to check ourselves if we do find ourselves colluding in coaching conversations?
What a great topic and question that Emma has brought in. And I know that that's something that as a mentor coach, as we both are, we will hear from time to time coaches, particularly new coaches, colluding with their clients. So when we say colluding, it means that they are potentially agreeing with what perhaps the client believes. And we might not, as a coach, particularly as a new coach, perhaps see the other opportunities or other sides or perspectives that might mean that that belief that the client is bringing in is true or not. So sometimes we can get caught in as coaches. Hopefully, Marie, you and I have learned to step back from that. But particularly new coaches can potentially, and I know this was true of myself as a new coach, that hearing my clients' stories, sometimes I would think, how do they get out of that? However, we know as master certified coaches, there are always different perspectives, different ways of seeing or perceiving a situation or experiencing a situation. And another form of collusion that comes to mind, Marie, and I'm sure you've got some versions as well, is when we hear our client, and again, I hear this in recordings, where a coach will hear what a client says about perhaps what they're going to do. And the coach might say, beautiful, or that sounds lovely, or excellent, or that sounds like a good thing to do. And so then we sort of we collude with our client in terms of, oh, that is the thing to do, when potentially maybe it's not. Maybe there is another way. So they're the sorts of collusion that comes up for me. What comes up for you, Marie?
Yeah, well, I think actually those two distinctions are really beautiful, Jeanine. So colluding with the story that the client tells you, the first example is your client might say, for example, oh, he always treats me like that. And the coach would collude by saying something like, oh, that's terrible. I'm so sorry you're experiencing that. So they get caught up in the details. And then, as you said, we have this, the client says, I'm going to do this. And we go, yes, excellent, wonderful. And so the balance of the partnership changes because then the coachee, the client, may want to please the coach and may want more of that kind of dopamine that's, oh, you're a good client, well done, you're doing so well. So that's often what we hear. And sometimes we hear it when the client and the coach have been in a relationship for a while, and
Yes.
they've built up trust and rapport, and the coach has heard stories, and so they've moved potentially from the role of the coach into, or the thinking partner, into a role of more of a friend. And they don't challenge the client in the way they may have at the beginning. So I notice it with some older coaches who've been in a long-term relationship with their clients, and they've stopped challenging their thinking. And or they may have the same experience that's happened to the client and relate to it so much that they buy into their story, and they think, yeah, I've experienced that and it's horrible, or whatever it is. And so then it's almost like the client and the coach move together too far, and the coach needs to find a way to step back and say, actually, what am I doing here? Because I'm not challenging the story that the client is telling me. As you said, there are so many perspectives. And if we're not able to challenge the story the client is making up, as Brené Brown says, or the perceptions or assumptions that the clients have, then we could potentially find ourselves colluding. And what often happens is we don't know it at the time. It's when we do our self-reflection afterwards that we think, oh, what am I doing here? That's interesting that I'm doing that. And it's often a great thing to bring to supervision. So both of us are supervisors. So we hear this a lot in our supervision practice. Am I colluding with a client? And why am I doing that? That interesting reason why I want to become maybe even liked by the client.
Yes, that's a beautiful way of bringing that collusion to life, Marie. And yes, if we feel as coaches, if we're feeling like the coaching conversation is comfortable, that potentially we are comfortable as a coach, and our clients as well are feeling comfortable. They're not pausing, they're not being stretched, they're not deep in reflection, then potentially we might recognize that we are colluding with their stories. And as you say, that's those stories can just go down a road versus us coming in as a coach to challenge those beliefs in a safe way, but it's still uncomfortable. It still feels uncomfortable, potentially for both the coach and the client, particularly if there is a strong connection between the two. But our role as coaches is to support our clients by challenging their thinking and stretching their thinking. And when we do that, it's going to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So if that's missing, that could be a clue that we are colluding with our clients and their stories. And that means no change is potentially happening.
Yes, that's a
And
key, isn't it?
It feels same versus, or perhaps it's gentle versus what the client really wants underneath it all, to create change, positive, powerful change that transforms their lives.
Yeah, really good point. And as you're talking, I do have a question. I'm thinking, as the client is talking about their stuff, and maybe they're doing the pattern of repeating what they often say, they always do that, they never do that. All of those generalities, I can't say that word. If we aren't, as coaches, showing them what they're doing, are we colluding? It's just come to me. Are we colluding when we aren't inviting them to notice what's happening? If we aren't brave enough to say, so client, I notice you're doing that thing again, or I notice that pattern of blaming keeps coming up time and time again. You might want to use another word if there isn't enough trust and rapport. Blaming can be quite triggering. But if we aren't able to reflect back, I'm wondering if that also could be a bit of collusion.
Mm. And, I think there's something there, Marie, for sure. And, that's going, I guess, much more into masterful coaching
Mm.
to reflect back those patterns, to be noticing what's happening in the system between the coach and the client beyond just the words. Um, it's really noticing those behavioral patterns, or those patterns of um, speaking or stories, and reflecting those back. And that's powerful, to reflect back the things that are outside of the more direct conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And also part of the question that came from Emma, if I recall correctly, it was, so what's the difference between having empathy for the client and championing and acknowledging the client and collusion?
Mm.
So for us, we have a clear definition of what those other things are. So how would you begin to explain that difference, Jeanine?
Mm. And so, and empathy, empathy, when we're being empathic, we're really appreciating the client's perspective. We can really put ourselves in their shoes and appreciate what they are saying, but at the same time, we don't want to get caught in the story that they're in. So we are being aware of what's happening for the client, aware of their story, but we're also stepping back to be able to not collude, but to support them to see another perspective.
Mm.
So the empathy is still there with the client, and as coaches, we want to bring that empathy in, because that's part of the support, trust and rapport. But in that support, trust and rapport, we also have permission with the client to challenge them about their stories, which may not be serving them, or maybe they are serving them, but perhaps there's still another perspective to notice.
Yeah. And
So,
so
so we,
I beg your
I
pardon,
just,
Jeanine, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so we can still be empathic, and we can still refrain from colluding. So
Yeah.
go ahead.
I was thinking that, sorry, I think there's a delay in the time on my side. I was thinking that you might say say the client's told you a story, you might say, that sounds hard. And what's not true about that? So you can empathize, you can understand that they might be feeling this is difficult, but our job is to help them see another perspective. So what's not true about that? Or what do you get out of telling yourself that? Or what's your experience of that
Mm.
in another way? So
Yeah.
that's how we know we're supporting the client to do thinking outside their normal way.
And to add to that great example, Marie, we could be saying to the client, that does sound hard.
Mm.
And I really acknowledge you for being able to come through this challenge, and wanting to do something about it, to create a different experience. And I'm wondering what's not true about that story that can serve and support you, something like that. So therefore we can have empathy, we can demonstrate empathy, we can acknowledge our client for who they are, and we can also not collude by asking them a question that supports them to identify another perspective.
Mm. And I think as you describe that, it's remembering that we need trust and rapport to be able to challenge the client's way of thinking in that capacity. So again, when we have trust and rapport, it helps us stay out of colluding. And of course, contracting with our clients, saying to our clients, my job is not to be your friend, it's to be your thinking partner. So I may challenge your thinking. I may get curious about it. How does that sound to you? How does that work for you? So you contract together so that when it might be happening, you might say to the client, you know what, I notice I'm actually agreeing with you and I'm moving outside of being your thinking partner. Because I think transparency is really so useful in the coaching practice to support vulnerability and courage. And when a coach can have the courage to say, you know what, I'm colluding with you here,
Mm.
then that
Yeah.
can bring another insight to the client as well. I think
Mm.
we also have to potentially remember that maybe we've got parallel process going on that we need to be aware of. So as coaches, if we're colluding, is that what people do with your client? And are you experiencing that in the session?
Mm.
That's worth unpacking in supervision as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And potentially in the coaching session is unpacking that.
Mm.
Um, and so the contracting is such an important and powerful piece to be able to, having that clearly in place to prevent colluding. And it's exactly as you shared, Marie, those sorts of things. It can potentially, so there's an education piece to contracting
Mm.
and letting the client know that, when I'm, stretching, supporting you to be that thinking partner, stretching your thinking, challenging your thinking, it will feel uncomfortable. It's not going to be a bed of roses. It will feel uncomfortable, but when you feel that discomfort, that is where that's where the growth is. That's where new awareness is being created. Just like having a baby, it's the birthing of something new and something beautiful and something powerful that will really support your life going forward. So is it okay when that uncomfortable feeling occurs? Is that okay to just stay with it and go with it? And if it's not, let me know
Yeah.
so that we can work through it, because that's where the learning edge is.
Yeah, that's so true, Jeanine. So that contracting, remember, coaches, it's a two-way thing. It's a building of agreements between the coach and the client so that we can be brave in our work. And I don't know if it's colluding, but if we find that our client is maybe agreeing with us or wanting to know our opinion, maybe there's some contracting that's missing around that too, that needs to be named. And we know contracting is a living, breathing experience within the coaching partnership. So it doesn't just start at the beginning. It can be used throughout the partnership to create even more trust and rapport and therefore more challenge.
Mm. And I believe it's potentially worthwhile from time to time checking in throughout a coaching program in relation to the contracting. Are we on track with not only the goals for the program, but in terms of how we work together? Is this working? Is there something else that we can bring in that can make this even more powerful? So it's worth that check-in versus assuming that where we start at the beginning is working for us now and going forward.
Yeah. And before we close off, if we can briefly touch on championing, and we touched a little bit on acknowledgement, but what does that sound like? What's the difference between those two in a coaching session as well? That might be useful for people to hear.
Mm. So yes, there is a difference. We believe there's a difference between championing and acknowledging. And we say in Empower World that acknowledgement occurs, it comes from a very sincere and genuine place when we notice something about our client that really stands out. That we really want to, again, be that mirror and reflect back something that we notice that is really that's touching our hearts, touching our whole selves, that we want to mirror back about the courage of a client or the love of a client or whatever it may be. So in that example earlier, I shared, I really acknowledge you as a client to be aware of this and to be going through this challenge. So something like that. Versus championing, which is supporting our clients in the moment when they're perhaps going through a really challenging time within the coaching session versus in their life. It's in the coaching session. They might be struggling with processing some emotions. And so we may want to support our client to let them know that they're exactly where they're meant to be to process what's coming up. So it's could sound something like, you're doing really well here to explore these what I'm hearing are challenging emotions, and I trust that this is going to support you to live the life that you want or to achieve the goal that you've brought in today, something along those lines. So it's supporting them in the moment with what they're experiencing, and they might be experiencing great joy. So we might want to champion that. And I'm noticing that you're lighting up, that your skin tone is brighter, your eyes are shining, and getting curious about what's coming up for the client. So there are those two differences. Acknowledging, we would say only do it when it's genuine. It's not something that's done over and over, because then it loses its genuine, authentic power. And again, champion.
Yeah, it does actually, Jeanine. I think the research shows that actually we can only take so much acknowledgement, because it can be a bit overwhelming because we don't often hear those acknowledgements. So if I give you what I feel for you, that you are, Jeanine, you are generous, you are thoughtful. If I went on and on and on, that you potentially wouldn't hear it, but accepting the gift of acknowledgement can be done in short spurts. This is why we manage it throughout the coaching conversation, as you mentioned. And I would say, Jeanine, as a champion, you're doing such a great job on this podcast, and your explanations are so wide and varied. And again, that's a championing of you to continue doing what you're doing. So a distinction. And we're not colluding with the client when we champion and acknowledge, because we're not buying into the client's story. We're seeing a trait in the client and we're naming it. Or we're seeing that them coming through something or staying with something beautiful, and we're supporting them.
Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah, so coaches, collusion, potentially the signs that you might be colluding with your client is when you feel comfortable, or there's no space in the conversation, there's no pauses. Your client speaks freely, and perhaps from their head versus from their heart. So when you notice that there's no big ahas, or pausing, slowing down, creating new, deeper ways of appreciating, understanding, and maybe making commitments, it could be a sign of collusion. Anything else, Marie, that you might add there
I
as
think
signs?
pay attention. Keep, we talk also about self as instrument in another of our podcasts. Pay attention to what's happening to you in the moment. Use your listening skills to see what's in the system between the two of you. And if it's happened and it's happening in the moment, name it. Have the courage to name it and explore what that could mean with a client. And if you don't catch it and you catch it afterwards, bring it to supervision to explore, because it may be a pattern that you have as a coach because you want to be liked, or you want to get the client somewhere, or maybe there's a fear of not getting any more work if you don't agree with the client. There's lots of things that happen for the coach when we're processing all of this. So bring it to a space to unpack.
Yes, absolutely. And that is such a powerful piece of advice to really notice what is going on for you as a coach, because we are reflections of one another. And so there could be all sorts of beautiful, powerful learning when we do that self-reflection, or go to a supervisor or a colleague to really unpack what's really going on here. So
coaches, thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. We trust that it's going to be useful for your practice. And if it is, we'd love you to share and comment and write in to us about other topics that you'd like to listen to us unpack. Or if you want to be a guest on the show, write in to us and we'll have a conversation with you.
yes, absolutely. And you may not be a coach as a listener of this podcast, but you can utilize this awareness, whether you're a leader in an organization or in a family. So we trust that whoever you are listening, that you'll get value out of what we've shared today. Thank you for listening.